Alright, let's step into the quiet, haunting world of the graveyard poets, a fascinating group of 18th century writers who stood right between the age of reason and the dawn of romanticism. Now, who were these poets? The term graveyard poets refers to a group of pre-romantic English poets who wrote reflective, often melancholic verse, meditating on death, mortality, and the mystery of the afterlife. Their poems were full of images like skulls, coffins, epitaphs, and worms. Yes, those exact words have been asked in exams. But here's what made them unique. They weren't being morbid just for shock value. Instead of sensationalizing death, they treated it as something philosophical and deeply emotional, a way to explore human fragility and divine mystery. Their writing expressed what later critics would call the sublime and the uncanny, two words you definitely want to remember for exam. Most of these poets were deeply religious, and quite a few were Christian clergymen, such as Thomas Parnell. Their poems often combined aesthetic beauty with moral reflection, gently reminding readers about the brevity of life, the vanity of worldly pleasures, and the hope of immortality. Interestingly, they were also antiquarian in spirit. They loved old churchyards, Gothic ruins, and medieval English verse. In fact, their fascination with the eerie and the emotional directly influenced both Gothic literature and the Romantic movement that came after. Now, what are the key works and names you must remember? The core texts of the graveyard school include Thomas Gray's Elegy, written in a country churchyard, the best-known poem of the group and a regular exam favorite. Thomas Parnell's A Night Piece on Death, often considered the earliest model of the genre. Robert Blair's The Grave, published in 1743. Edward Young's Night Thoughts, a long, meditative poem exploring loss, faith, and eternity. All four of these have been directly asked in exam questions. The label graveyard school itself, by the way, wasn't used in their own time. The term was coined later in 1898 by literary historians who noticed their shared themes, and yes, that's another exam point. So, who belongs to the school? Well, the list is longer than you might expect. Alongside Gray, Parnell, Young, and Blair, you'll also find William Cowper, Oliver Goldsmith, Thomas Wharton, William Collins, Thomas Chatterton, Mark Akenside, Joseph Wharton, Henry Kirke, White Thomas Percy, and even James Thomson, who's sometimes included for his meditative tone in the Seasons. Each poet brings something slightly different. Goldsmith adds warmth and humanity, Cowper brings introspection and faith, and Gray elevates the style to sheer lyrical beauty. Together, they form a bridge between the rational order of the 18th century and the emotional power of Romanticism. So, to sum it up, the graveyard poets turned death into art, melancholy into meditation, and reflection into beauty. Their quiet churchyards became the birthplace of both Gothic imagination and romantic feeling. Here's a simple way to remember the key writers of the graveyard poets group. Think of it as two short memory codes that make the name stick easily. Code 1 is granite, gold, copper, crystal. Granite stands for Thomas Gray, the poet of the famous Elegy written in a country churchyard. Gold reminds you of Oliver Goldsmith, the writer of The Deserted Village. Copper brings to mind William Cowper, whose poetry mixes faith with deep emotion. And crystal helps you recall Christopher Smart, best known for his poem Jubilate Agno. Code 2 is the phrase Robert Young Collins met James Chatterton on Thomson's Dying Hill. Here, Robert is Robert Blair, author of The Grave. Young refers to Edward Young, who wrote Night Thoughts. Collins stands for William Collins, known for his Odes. Met represents James Macpherson, the creator of the Ossian poems. James is James Thomson, the poet of The Seasons. Chatterton points to Thomas Chatterton, the young genius of the Rowley poems. And Dying Hill reminds you of John Dyer, who wrote Grongar Hill. So, If you ever forget who belonged to the graveyard poet circle, just recall these two phrases. Granite, gold, copper, crystal, and Robert Young Collins met James Chatterton on Thomson's Dying Hill. Together, they bring back the entire family of poets who turned meditations on death into timeless beauty. All right, let's talk about Thomas Gray, one of the most refined, sensitive, and quietly influential poets of the 18th century. Gray was born in London in 1716, the son of a wealthy but difficult lawyer. His mother, though, was the real backbone of his life. She ran a small boarding school to support his education, a fact that shows her incredible devotion. Gray went to Eton and then Cambridge, and yes, both these institutions have been mentioned in exam questions. At Cambridge, he became close friends with Horace Walpole, and the two even toured Italy together. When they returned, their friendship cooled for a while, apparently over trivial quarrels, but they later reconciled. Gray eventually took his degree and stayed at Cambridge for the rest of his life. He was offered the position of Poet Laureate in 1757, but politely declined, preferring quiet study. He did, however, accept a professorship at Cambridge, though he never once lectured. Gray lived a solitary, scholarly life. He was shy, fastidious, and a perfectionist, a man who wrote little but polished everything he did to brilliance. His first major poem, Ode on a Distant Prospect of Eton College, appeared in 1747. It's a nostalgic reflection on his school days and the fleeting innocence of youth. The famous line where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. That's from this poem, and it's been asked in exam countless times. But his real masterpiece came just a few years later, Elegy written in a country churchyard, published in 1751. It's one of the most beloved poems in English literature. Set in a quiet churchyard at dusk, the poem reflects on mortality, obscurity, and the dignity of common life. Its phrases, "the paths of glory lead but to the grave," for example, have entered the language itself. Critics often say the elegy feels both familiar and fresh, and that's the secret to its enduring power. Now, Gray didn't stop there. In 1757, he published The Progress of Poesy and The Bard, both written in the grand Pindaric style inspired by the Greek poet Pindar. Remember, The Progress of Poesy and The Bard together form his famous Pindaric Odes, and both titles have been asked in exam. These odes were admired for their energy and ornament, though some found them obscure. Even Dr. Samuel Johnson, never one to flatter easily, thought Gray's style was too adorned. Still, Gray's odes have a majestic rhythm, and they were pioneering attempts to bring classical structure to English romantic feeling. Beyond poetry, Gray was also a brilliant letter writer. His travel letters, especially those describing the Lake District, reveal a sensitivity to nature far ahead of his time, a true forerunner of Wordsworth. His prose is vigorous, elegant, and full of keen observation. Let's not forget his shorter poems. They are often playful, polished, and exam favorites. Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat, drowned in a tub of goldfishes, written in 1747, is a mock-heroic elegy about Walpole's cat Selima. The moral is witty. What female heart can gold despise? What cat's averse to fish? And of course the lesson, nor all that glisters gold. Yes, this poem and even the cat's name have been asked in exam. He also wrote On the Death of Richard West, an elegy for his close friend, and Ode on the Spring, both from 1742. Later came The Fatal Sisters, inspired by Norse legend, reflecting Gray's growing fascination with ancient Celtic and Scandinavian myths, another sign of early Romanticism. So, if we step back, what do we see in Gray? He's the poet who bridges worlds classic in form but romantic in spirit. He combined polished craftsmanship with genuine emotion, sympathy for the poor, and love for nature. He may have written little, but as Samuel Johnson admitted grudgingly, he touched nothing that he did not adorn. In short, Thomas Gray's slender body of work remains one of the most exquisite chapters in English poetry, proof that even a quiet voice can echo across centuries. Alright, let's step into Thomas Gray's dramatic world of prophecy and poetry with the Bard, a Pindaric Ode, published in 1757. Now, this poem marks a turning point in English literature. It's often considered a foundation stone of the Romantic movement in Britain, and that's been asked in exam. Gray blends history, legend, and imagination into one haunting vision. The setting takes us back to medieval Wales, right after King Edward I's conquest of the Welsh. Another detail to remember for exam. Edward's army is marching through the rugged mountains of Snowdonia when they suddenly encounter a lone Welsh bard standing on a cliff. He is the last survivor of his race. All other bards have been killed by Edward's forces, who sought to erase Welsh culture and identity. This surviving bard becomes the voice of defiance. He curses Edward and calls upon the shades of the dead, Welsh heroes Cadwallo, Urien, and Modred, to join him. That invocation of these three legendary figures has been directly asked in exam. Together, they weave a dark prophecy foretelling the downfall of the Plantagenet line and the endless misery that will haunt Edward's descendants. But the poem isn't just about vengeance, it's also deeply visionary. The bard looks beyond destruction and predicts the return of Welsh rule through the Tudor dynasty. He foresees a future where art, poetry, and inspiration will be reborn in England, a beautiful reversal of Edward's attempt to silence the voice of poetry. This prophecy of a flowering of British poetry is another point often tested in exam. Gray closes his poem by celebrating the great English poets who would carry that prophetic voice forward: Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton. Their names are mentioned directly, and yes, that's another key exam line. It's as if the bard, before throwing himself from the mountain into the river below, passes his mantle of inspiration on to the next generations of poets. What makes the Bard so special is how it fuses prophecy, history, and national revival. It's inspired by Gray's fascination with medieval history and Welsh music, both of which were central to the growing Celtic revival in 18th century art and literature. In a way, this poem gives England its own mythic origin story for Romanticism, where the poet stands not just as an artist, but as a prophet and defender of the nation's soul. So, when you think of the Bard, think of three key ideas: Edward's conquest of Wales and the Bard's curse, the invocation of Welsh heroes Cadwallo, Urien, and Modred, and the prophecy of poetic rebirth through Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton. Gray's The Bard isn't just a poem, it's a declaration that poetry survives kings, empires, and history itself. Alright, let's talk about one of the most loved poems in English literature, Thomas Gray's Elegy, written in a country churchyard. It was completed around 1751, and legend has it that Gray was inspired while living near the quiet Stoke Poges parish church. That location has been asked in exam, so keep it in mind. Now, this isn't just any elegy. It's a deeply meditative poem, a reflection on death, obscurity, and remembrance. Gray may have been influenced by the death of his close friend Richard West in 1742. Unlike earlier elegies that mourn famous figures, this one honors ordinary, unknown villagers, people who lived honest but uncelebrated lives. The structure of the poem is beautifully simple. It's written in quatrains, that's stanzas of 4 lines, each line containing 10 syllables, iambic pentameter, and following an A-B rhyme scheme. That alternating rhyme pattern, along with its calm rhythm, gives the elegy its steady, reflective tone, and all these structural details have been asked in exam. Gray wrote this during the Age of Enlightenment, a time of great intellectual questioning, but the poem feels deeply emotional and personal. It shows how Enlightenment reason met Romantic sentiment halfway. That's why Gray is often called a transitional poet. The poem opens at evening, when the day is ending and the world is sinking into stillness. We hear the church bell tolling across the quiet fields, another exam point, as shepherds and cattle return home from work. The atmosphere is rural, peaceful, but also heavy with melancholy. We hear the hooting of owls, the buzz of beetles, the soft sounds of nature as darkness spreads. The speaker walks through the churchyard surrounded by gravestones, imagining the lives of the people buried there, the ploughman, the farmer, the village smithy, all those who lived honest, humble lives far from fame and fortune. He recognizes that death is the great equalizer. Kings and peasants, rich and poor, all share the same fate. Wealth and glory may fade, but character and virtue live on. In one famous line, Gray writes, "Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife," a phrase that later inspired Thomas Hardy's novel Far from the Madding Crowd, and yes, that connection has been asked in exam. What makes this elegy so powerful is its empathy. Gray doesn't just mourn these villagers, he honors them. He believes that if they had been given opportunity, they might have achieved greatness. But even without fame, they had integrity, kindness, and simplicity values worth remembering. Toward the end, the tone shifts. The poet imagines his own death. A second speaker enters, describing how the poet himself now lies buried among the very villagers he once eulogized. The final epitaph, written in the third person, suggests Gray's humility. He was a youth to fortune and to fame unknown. It's as if the poet accepts that true peace lies not in fame, but in rest and remembrance. Critic Samuel Johnson famously said that Gray spoke in two languages, the public and the private. Public because he wrote in the elegant, formal style of his age. Private because he filled it with deep personal emotion. That contrast is another point that's been asked in exam. So, to sum it up, Gray's elegy gives us a rural setting at dusk, quatrains in iambic pentameter, a universal meditation on death, and a democratic vision of equality in the grave. It bridges classical restraint and romantic sensitivity, which is why it stands at the very heart of the age of transition.